Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everyone on Zoom. Thank you very much for tuning in, wherever you are. It's great to see you, new faces, old faces. Good evening to everybody who's come tonight. It's really great to have such a crowd on this first week, because we're a little ahead of the term. Radical anthropology is not really part of the UCL curriculum. It's an autonomous class that's been going as an evening class for open to the public for 40 more years, like late 70s. Chris started it all off. And it is a kind of public forum for discussion of topics of what it means to be human, anthropology in its widest sense. And we like to break down all the barriers between, the biological anthropology over here, social anthropology over here, drag them to each other, screaming, and make them talk to each other. That's what our kind of whole purpose in life is, really. And we specialize in issues of how we became human, what made us human origins, which we'll have some talk about in other talks in the term, as well as bringing in, top sort of biology and fossil and primate specialists, plus social anthropologists who have really got some very interesting things to say. A lot of people from this department, including people like Toy and Adbetu, that I think we'll hear later in the term. I wanted to have all live talks this term because we have had some Zoom interpolations over the last few years, obviously. However, we have to respect the UCU strike actions. So what happens next week is that we're going to go back on Zoom only because there is expected, I don't expect it to change at this stage, to be a UCU strike during Freshers Week. Our whole theory is about human culture began on the picket line, so we don't want to do anything that might be construed as crossing picket lines. We think it's okay to do Zoom. It's not a digital picket line because we've been doing that class anyway. But at the moment, UCL is providing us with this venue. It's wonderful. We love UCL. We're affiliated at UCL, and we did our PhDs here, so this is our kind of home. And it's one of the places where anthropology really joins up. UCL, we have the Institute of Archaeology over in the other building. We have biological and social anthropologists. They don't always talk to each other, but in our experience, in our trying to, our studies, our researches, we've always been trying to talk to each other. We don't think it's possible to deal with the question, what it is to be human, unless we have all those different perspectives. It's got to be a matter of those interdisciplinary perspectives. Okay, so there's not much more I can say regarding Chris. Chris can introduce himself. He's going to be speaking tonight on quite a trendy social anthropology topic, perspectivism. His title is, Can Indigenous and Western Perspectives See Eye to Eye the Value of Two-Eyed Seeing? So this is very much a RAG remit. How do we reconcile sort of Western science with Indigenous cosmologies? Can it be done? Over to Chris. I need you in the Zoom.
Yes, okay. So yes, anthropology only asks one question, but of course is a very big one. What does it mean to be human? And as Camilla was saying, here at UCL, we address that issue from a number of different angles. We can ask, what might it mean to be almost human? Like, for example, a close biological relative of ours, a gorilla or a chimpanzee. What might it be to be kind of a prehistoric human or an extinct version of a human, like a Neanderthal, or going back Homo erectus? So that's looking at chimpanzees is primatology and biological anthropology. Looking at fossils would be paleontology and archaeology. And of course, there's social anthropology, where we look at all the different ways there are all around the world of being human, respecting the sacred, bringing up kids, organizing kinship and sex. So, as Camilla was saying, we just don't agree with the way in which kind of the powers that be fragment our understanding of this absolutely critical question. What does it mean to be human? We are bodies, we are minds, we are social, we are individual, we're all these different things. Let's join up the dots and trying to put the big picture together. One thing that we've always done within the radical anthropology group is kind of reverse the way in which historically anthropology has seen itself. We even think of ourselves as doing reverse anthropology, and I'll just say what I mean by that. In the past, you had anthropology as kind of armchair theoreticians, Lewis Henry Morgan, various other, James Fraser, kind of looking at other cultures and kind of trying to work out what they might teach us. The 20th century saw a major shift from evolutionist anthropology, looking at everything within an evolutionary perspective, to what was called functionalism, which was essentially a product of colonialism. So the whole purpose of academic anthropology is an academic discipline. It kind of began down the road at the LSE with Bronislaw Malinowski, but of course A.R. Radcliffe Brown and various others. And from their point of view, the value of anthropology was that it would help the colonial rulers in Africa and other parts of the world to kind of work out how traditional societies worked in order to be able to control them and exploit them. And this is quite explicit in A.R. Radcliffe Brown's case. Anthropology teaches us how to more efficiently manipulate, exploit, and control the savages. When the savages, if you like, when the colonial people made that more and more difficult, and we had the colonial revolution and the Second World War and everything else that followed that, then anthropology had to start thinking about other ways to justify its existence. And one of the major figures to completely change the whole perspective really was Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French founder of what's called structuralist anthropology. And he kind of looked at the whole planet of various different ways of being human, as if from sort of Mars, as if from somewhere outside, in an attempt to kind of look at, just so many disappearing patterns of organizing human lives. I mean, he was just aware that Western culture is a Western monoculture. It just gives us one version. Let's try and piece together all the other different ways of being human. And in particular, he spent his life studying mythology, and he worked out this vast 3-volume work, Mythology, the science of mythology, came up with this astonishing conclusion that all the world's magical myths and fairy tales are variations on a theme, and ultimately they are one myth only. That's a little bit of a background. When I was mentioning reverse anthropology, it was quite connected to the topic of this evening's talk, which is two-eyed seeing, because let me just give you an example. I've always thought that development is a very good idea. And what I mean by that is that we in the West need to be developed morally, politically, socially, in terms of childcare, all kinds of things. We would benefit from being developed. But of course, the colonialists had this idea that somehow we're going to develop them. And it seems to me that we're in very great need of development at all kinds of levels. And so instead of thinking of ourselves as sort of studying the natives, studying the people outside, it's kind of getting aware of ourselves in this culture through other lenses. So looking at Western culture through the eyes, for example, of an Aboriginal Australian or anyone else from a very, very different culture. And of course, an Aboriginal Australian would be just very, very puzzled by the fact that, for example, in this culture over here, a child has one mother and one father. I mean, how on earth can she or he possibly manage? In our culture, we have a thing called classificatory kinship, and the kinship terminologies of just about every traditional culture, really, until you start getting cities. The people just refuse to make a distinction, like mine and thine in respect of children. I mean, two sisters will simply say, in the language this is, in the kinship terminology, my sister's child is my child. And the result of that is you get a whole mass of different, every child can go to this mother, this mother, this mother, because your mother's sister is also your mother. Two sisters will say, my daughter's child is my child. And of course that acted out to sometimes to a greater extent or a lesser extent in real life, so that children really do have a choice of which mum they want to be with on any particular day of the week. So that's kind of I think something which we need to learn. And we now know, actually, as it so happens, that although Bronislaw Malinowski, the founder of functionalist anthropology down at the LSE, he said that any form of collective motherhood is nonsense. No child can have two mothers. It's impossible. It doesn't work biologically. And he also said if any bunch of geese, silly geese he called them, meaning women, feminists, thought that childcare should be shared, it would lead to absolute. He actually said it would lead to a worse catastrophe than the French Revolution or even the Bolshevik Revolution. So you can see there's always been a bit of politics, a bit of an understatement there in terms of these kind of issues. Now, specifically, two-eyed seeing is a term invented. It's called etuamtmunk. I'm certainly not pronouncing that correctly, but an indigenous scholar, Albert Marshall, in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, one of the Inuit people, but he belongs to the Mi'kmaq tribe. He said that if you look through two eyes, you can see depth. And he advocated. He was one of many indigenous people who are actually quite keen on Western science. I mean, who've done PhDs and so on. But he just says, while we're doing Western science, from his point of view, it's always important to temper the perspective of Western science with his own indigenous understandings of how things connect up. And my colleague here, Jerome Lewis, who's not here this evening, we were writing a piece for some indigenous rights activists, and he's just been, Jerome, my colleague, has been telling me that, and I kind of knew this, but of course it's more and more of the case that Aboriginal Australian traditional thinkers were extraordinarily brilliant astronomers. I mean, Aboriginal people did astronomy on a level that white men just couldn't even begin to understand, and quite often in their myths, there are references to things in the sky that astronomers in the West have only recently kind of discovered. But many of these indigenous scholars in Australia, in North America, in South America, and other parts of the world, whilst remaining faithful to indigenous traditions and ways of seeing the world, are also doing PhDs, for example, in climate science, while at the same time understanding that their own indigenous ways of dealing with nature were actually a lot more sustainable and clever and scientific in so many ways than Western methods. But somehow combining Western science with indigenous knowledge, indigenous science, I would say, finding points of convergence is a rather interesting and important job, because as far as I'm concerned, I'm a scientist. I'm actually, it sounds a bit strange to say this, but I'm interested in what really did happen during the course of evolution on this planet for us to emerge as the extraordinary species we are with, for example, language. I mean, language is an extraordinary thing. Nothing remotely like human language with its kind of forms of grammar and also the ability to specify imaginary things exists on the planet. All other animals have got very sophisticated systems of communication, don't get me wrong, but the digital structure and grammatical structure of language is kind of off the scale, something quite different. I want to know how it happened. And I just don't think, I would say somebody living in a city to sort of say, well, I don't really believe in science. I just think it's unacceptable, to be honest. I just think it's unworthy. Somebody that says, I think with my gut. I mean, we know various politicians that tell us that they think with their gut about various things, COVID, vaccines, all sorts of climate science and stuff. But to me, science has to be respected. And actually science itself, let's remember, is many-eyed seeing. Because in science, you have to put your hypothesis to test. You have to present it in such a way that other people can follow your steps, follow the evidence you cite. And you can't just be a guru in science. You have to, science at the end of the day, however much you get brilliant individuals thinking up wonderful ideas, at the end of the day, what's science is what has been tried and tested and tested to almost a breaking point so often by, almost anyone that comes up with a scientific theory, everyone's initially critical, and so you sort of get pulled down as a kind of egalitarian leveling effect of everyone else trying to pull your theory down, and what survives the criticism. What survives the testing is what we call science. So from my standpoint, science is already a thoroughly collectivist, and although of course it's elitist in the sense that to be involved in the scientific community, levels of privilege and education and so on take you away from so many other people, on that level it's collectivist and kind of, at least ideally, at least in principle, and I suppose I should stress that in principle, egalitarian, because there's no doubt at all, of course, that all sorts of corrupt goings-on occur within science, as in so many other areas of life. Right. Many-eyed seeing is linked, I think, to a very interesting development within social anthropology. I mentioned Claude Lévi-Strauss. What I didn't mention was what happened subsequently. Claude Lévi-Strauss worked on mythology, fundamentally North and South American mythology. Anyone who's interested in magical myths and fairy tales, including our own fairy tales over in this part of the world, in Europe, myths anywhere in the world, and when I say magical, I don't mean sort of myths in the sense of stories about what happened last year or various other years, which are sort of got a mythical element. I would argue that to counter the magical myth of the kind Lévi-Strauss is looking at, you've got to be able to die and come alive again. There's a kind of central magic in all those stories involving death and rebirth, which I think is the sort of core magical element in any of these myths. You go into the other world, it's the world of the dead. Moving from the world of the living to the world of the dead, it's kind of, okay, yeah, we die. So, you're alive, something happens, you bleed, you're dead. And of course, that's not magical. But then comes the magic bit, you come back to life. And that is just such a central part of magical mythology around the world that we have to kind of try to work out what's going on there and why that motif of death followed by resurrection is so universally a part of mythology. But I wanted to say that following Lévi-Strauss, very unfortunately, in my view, nearly all anthropologists in this part of the world sort of gave up on Lévi-Strauss. They didn't feel he'd convincingly shown them the kind of universal structure of all these different stories. It all seemed a bit complicated with these 4 volumes, it's like, I found it difficult to read those volumes, but I'm one of the unusual people that in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, I just decided I've got to read these things. So these vast volumes, incredibly complicated. When you're reading myth number 378B, you've got to remember what myth number 274C was. So you've got to go through it all and check it. Oh yes, he seems to be right. But it's a huge lot of work. And also at the very end of Mythologique, it kind of ended with a kind of whimper, really, because he sort of said, well, these myths don't really tell us anything much, except the difference between being and nothingness. And he sort of cited Hamlet, to be or not to be. And I just thought, there must be a bit more to it all than that. So over here in England, Europe, I think Australia to an extent, somehow Lévi-Strauss, because he'd raised hopes to such an extent that all was going to be revealed, and then somehow it was a bit of a disappointment. There was a kind of almost revulsion against his paradigm within anthropology, which is called structuralism, structural anthropology, but not in South America. South America being a place where the myths that Lévi-Strauss was dealing with are still kind of alive, in the sense that the people that tell the myths are still around, still there, still fighting back against imperialism, against colonialism, the remnants of all that Spanish occupation, and so on in South America. In South America, somehow the myths were still attached to living rituals and living people, and kind of Lévi-Strauss's work carried on. And so, let me say this: today, that's like the dominant paradigm, the dominant theoretical framework within social anthropology is called perspectivism. When I've given a few talks just a few months ago on this, I have to admit that perspectivism has hit me only rather recently. people have said, my friend Denise Arnold in Bolivia have said, Chris, why do you think this is fashionable, the latest thing? How come you've been so slow off the mark, you people over in Britain and in Europe? We've been doing perspectivism since 1998. And I can just tell you again why. It's a little bit like what I was saying earlier on. I regard myself as a scientist. I think, for me, I don't know, science is, when it's working, when it is genuine science, it's kind of almost the only game in town. But perspectivism, perhaps I should say that the major figure in perspectivism is a Brazilian anthropologist. I'm just speaking to some of you who kind of know this. Forgive me if I'm telling you stuff you already know, but Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, an inhabitant of Rio, who developed a paradigm within anthropology which is intentionally an intervention within philosophy. Viveiros de Castro wants to explode, transform, revolutionize philosophy. And I have to say, in the past, and I'm still really there, I haven't moved too much, I thought if you really want to study philosophy, don't do philosophy, study anthropology. Because then you've got people from all over the world teaching you real philosophy. But Eduardo Viveiros de Castro is a follower of Deleuze and other French philosophers, Deleuze, Guattari, and others. And I had no appetite whatever for Deleuze. I just felt I'm trying to work out what happened as we became human during evolution. And I don't feel I need to get into Deleuze, one of whose famous statements is, underneath all reason lies delirium and drift. And I can maybe understand what he's talking about, but I just felt I don't have the energy to get into all this, even though I'm sure for philosophers it's all very exciting and interesting. So I'm using that example to sort of explain why Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's perspectivism passed me by. I've been spending the last 20 years trying to work out how language evolved in our species. And at no time did Deleuze or Eduardo Viveiros de Castro emerge in any of our discussions, because it just didn't seem even remotely relevant. So it sort of passed me by, and I'm slightly embarrassed to say that, because I now realize I should have had my antennae more finely tuned to these very exciting and interesting developments. And just to say, today, as I speak, as we're here, perspectivism, particularly the kind of perspectivism that Viveiros de Castro represents, is the dominant paradigm. I mean, if you're doing social anthropology, if you're coming to UCL to study social anthropology, you can't get away from perspectivism. It's the main thing these days. So, a little bit on perspectivism. In particular on a very influential article which was published in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute in 1998, Cosmological Deixis and Amerindian Perspectivism. So what this article does, and I've read it lots of times, it is very interesting, it celebrates binary thought. It celebrates a kind of dialectic, one thing as opposed to its opposite. And so what he does in that article is show that everything that I think is not only wrong, but beautifully wrong, like precisely wrong from the perspective of Amazonian thought. So let me just give you some examples. What I think is that we have a planet, and it's one planet, and it's been evolving life ever since there was a big collision with a huge other planet which turned into the moon about 4.5 billion years ago. And I won't go into all the details, all the major evolutionary transitions, but it took a very long time for life on this planet to end up with us human beings, with our strange languages and what we call culture, and in particular symbolic culture. So we now have rockets, we have bulldozers, other people have plows, hunter-gatherers have bows and arrows, they have cooking and all these things, these cultural accomplishments. So from where I'm standing, you have nature, and it kind of evolves into culture, or you have single-celled organisms, and you have little things floating around in the sea, blue-green algae. Then you have fish, and then you have mammals, and then eventually you get primates, and eventually you get humans. So you move from nature to culture. Well, according to Amerindian perspectivism, and as far as I can work out, correct me if I'm wrong, Viveros de Castro likes this idea. It's all the other way around, because Amerindian myths tell that originally humans and animals all spoke the same language. Jaguars had cooking fire, tapirs had bows and arrows, all the animals had culture, and culture came before we had natural animals. And what happened, according to the mythology, is that the jaguar, who invented cooking fire, was robbed. Who was the jaguar robbed by? Humans. So today, jaguars have to eat their meat raw. Okay? But in the past, they had their meat cooked because they had control of cooking fire. Humans have stolen cooking fire from the jaguars. And the same applies to all the other animals. So the tapirs, and anacondas, snakes, other animals, peccaries and so on, they all had culture. And one of the results of that origin, like they all had culture, was that today, again, this is Amerindian belief, according to Viveros de Castro, the animals, among themselves within each species, know one another as human beings. So this is how it goes. We in the West think that humans have souls. I mean, this is obviously, if you brought up in one of these patriarchal religions, humans have souls, animals don't have souls. Well, the Amerindians say that all animals have souls. But souls are things which humans have and animals have. And if you've got a soul, you have intentionality, agency, self-awareness, and all the mental capacities that humans have. So according to Amerindian philosophy, because these animals have souls, they all kind of have the same culture. They all have the same set of beliefs about what a soul is and the soul is kind of in some ways different from the Christian idea of soul. The soul is much more linked up with blood and body and so on than perhaps the kind of very big dichotomy between body and soul in Western Christian modes of thought. But still, the idea is this, that the jaguars see other jaguars as human beings. The tapirs see other tapirs as human beings. So all the animals, all the major prey animals and predator animals that humans are aware of. So humans, we treat in South America, jaguars as quite dangerous predators, and we treat tapir as lovely animals to hunt and kill. The point is that the jaguars see one another as human beings. And so when we see a jaguar drinking blood, the jaguar knows that it's actually drinking manioc beer, because humans love this lovely fermented beer. So we, as a human being, might see somewhere in Amazonia a peccary on a muddy bank licking the salt lick. And we just say, okay, it's a tapir licking salt. But the tapir itself sees itself as in a great ceremonial house, and they've all gathered together for a big initiation ritual. So can you see what I'm trying to say? I'm trying to say that this is a belief system. As far as I can work out, the perspectivists in anthropology admire that belief system. What I certainly know is that Viveros de Castro treats Darwinism as a myth. And I think he thinks of it as a colonialist myth. In fact, he does think that. So perspectivism is like the decolonizing of thought by celebrating and vindicating and validating this complete reversal of what we in the West think of as science, which the perspectivists regard as the result of colonialism. So, whereas I still think this, by the way, I think you have nature, and then you have culture, and we have animals who become human, some of us, some of the animals. Perspectivism kind of reverses that. And one other very important thing about perspectivism, according to Viveros de Castro, it's not just, well, he makes it very clear, what your perspective is doesn't depend on your soul, because all souls are human souls, they're all the same, and all the animals think of themselves as human within their groups. But of course the animals have different bodies. And what determines the kind of perspective you have is your body. So obviously, if you climb in the trees, if you've got wings, you'll have a different perspective on the world than if you're like a snake on the ground. If you where you are, what kind of body you have, what kind of eyes you have, clearly will make a difference to the perspective you have. But what we should try to do is what a shaman does. So a shaman doesn't just adopt a human perspective and just notice all the animals around. The shaman turns into an anaconda, turns into a jaguar, turns into one of these animals, and then is able to see how the animals see one another, these animals viewing one another as humans. Have I made myself clear? It's the exact symmetrical, dialectical reverse of what Western scientists would say. And it's kind of beautiful, because it's not just, as I say, not just different, it's absolutely beautifully mirror image, upside down view of the world. Yeah? Right.
So, sorry, and I am probably completely wrong, but surely in sort of our common thinking, they all see each other as, like animals would see each other as alike anyway.
Well,
so like the way that I would picture a jaguar or imagine a jaguar, they are thinking of other jaguars as being.
No, they're thinking of other jaguars as being humans, according to perspectivism. Can I really encourage you to ask that question when I've done the next little bit?
I'll try and remember it. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Right. So, one of the things which Lévi-Strauss taught was that all of these myths are about the transition from nature to culture. So his first volume of Mythologique was called The Raw and the Cooked. And it was based on the idea that we humans eat our meat cooked. And we eat our meat cooked, not just because it's perhaps easier to digest for various other reasons, but for kind of ritual reasons, because blood is taboo, and eating blood is a kind of very strong taboo against different kinds of blood. The blood of hunted game animals, menstrual blood, other forms of blood. The blood has to be respected. It's got huge symbolic potency. And you don't just kill an animal and eat it while it's bleeding or after it's dead but still covered in blood. It's only rendered safe for consumption when it's been put in the fire and all visible blood has been removed by the cooking process. And if you do get an animal and eat it raw, that's what a jaguar would do, that's what a lion would do, that's what an animal would do, and we are human. So Lévi-Strauss' argument was that this story is about how it was that culture emerged, and one of the things which happened was that men invented cooking. Another thing which Lévi-Strauss said was that if you eat your own kill, you eat your own meat, that's kind of like incest. It's like enjoying your own blood, your own sister, your own brother, your own offspring, and you don't consume your own blood. You offer your blood, your kin, your relatives to others to, quote, eat, in the sense of enjoy, consume. And so, and the incest taboo was another thing which was invented by, guess what, men. So a whole lot of things, wearing ornaments, wearing clothes, cooking, all of these were invented by men. I won't go into all the reasons. He says that it was invented by men, and basically it's because men are culture and women are nature, and men being culture, established culture. And his theory, this is Lévi-Strauss' theory, is that men kind of one day realized, having previously been incestuous, rather like an alpha male chimpanzee, keeping all the females in his own harem and having sex with them if he can get away with it. These evolving humans, according to Levi-Strauss, realized something happened in their head, kind of a digital distinction came. They were able to sort of distinguish sister from wife and make an opposition there. But what the reason they did it was to form relationships with in-laws. So if men were starting to think, if I give away my sisters, instead of having sex with my sisters, I give my sisters to other men. With any luck, those men will give me their sisters, and we've got an in-law relationship. And that was his explanation for the origin of the incest taboo. I mean, scientifically, I have to say, nothing could be more improbable than that idea. It makes absolutely no sense. I mean, really, absolutely no sense whatsoever. I mean, as soon as you look at non-human primates, you realize that the female chimpanzees, they don't like at all being harassed by their older brothers or fathers. You know, and the reason is, of course, if there is something wrong with incest, it's the female who will pay, because the male can always have sex with somebody else as well as his sister or daughter or whatever. So it's and of course, human males aren't all that, you know, well known for being hugely successful in avoiding these sexual things. So I mean, it makes absolutely zero sense. But we live in a patriarchal world, and the theory became hugely influential. And I suppose what I'm saying now is that, well, first of all, let me just put it really bluntly. Those myths are nothing whatever to do with the origin of culture. So all of those myths that Levi-Strauss studies, as soon as you look at them carefully, you can see exactly what's going on. They're not about the emergence of culture. They are about the emergence of male dominance over women. And the nature, which is so apparently concrete, isn't nature at all. It's women treated as nature, treated as body rather than mind. And the problem is that perspectivism has kind of carried on with that kind of assumption that we're talking about nature and culture in those terms. And one of the things which a really brilliant social anthropologist, Luisa Belaunde, has been pointing out in response to what's happening. She's been working in South America. She points out that this thing called perspectivism, which is looking at the world from these different perspectives, you know, a parrot's perspective, a jaguar's perspective, an anaconda's perspective. It's all sorts of different perspectives, but there's one perspective missing, says Luisa, and that's a gender perspective, because the whole paradigm is entirely looking at things from, like as if gender wasn't important, whereas actually gender is hugely important. And Luisa Belaunde just takes a particular aspect of the body of males and females as a kind of illustration of what's wrong with perspectivism as it is at the moment. And she points out that women, well, everybody knows that women cycle and menstruate. That's a bodily feature, of course. But she points out that the perspectivists treat menstruation and the rituals around menstruation purely in terms of the oppression of women. A woman has to go into a hut, she's secluded, she's dirty, she's polluted, she has to be, her blood is dangerous and all the rest of it. And what Belaunde is saying is that, yes, of course, in a patriarchal society, that is how women, especially when they're menstruating, do tend to get treated. But what she points out is the enormous, huge potency of menstrual blood, enormous power, terrifying power, if you like, of menstruation. And she says what we need is an Amazonian hematology, because if you don't understand the significance of blood as a potent liquid shared by game animals and by women, you can't begin to make sense of anything going on in the myths which Eduardo Viveros de Castro analyzes. Next point. I see some very puzzled faces around. I'm hoping you're all kind of following a kind of thread. Let me just say, the animals that Viveros de Castro is talking about, they're very strange animals, of course. I mean, when I read that stuff, I think, what are we talking about? Why on earth would jaguars think they're humans? What is going on? Why would peccaries think they're humans? Why would tapirs? I mean, what on earth is going on here? And to be honest, I don't think that saying that that's how Amazonian people think, I don't even think that's celebrating their thought. I think it's saying something which is actually quite, I don't know, quite dubious. I mean, surely, I think there's probably in your question, surely to say that Amazonians who hunt animals, live with them, live in the forest, very familiar with them, for them to seriously think that all these animals think of themselves as humans, I just don't even believe it. And I don't believe it. It's not what's going on. So let me explain. Every animal is two. There's two versions of the animal. One's the body, one's a sort of potent soul animal, which you can't even kill. It's immortal. Again, that needs explaining. Obviously it does. But let me just say, let me give you an example. And it's still around this topic of menstruation, which is so, so important. It's important within RAG. I've written a whole book about it all, and Camilla's written about it. We are aware that very simply, if you want to get to the ultimate, most primordial, sacred prohibition, the root of all taboo, what's the most taboo substance in the world for humans? Well, yes, it is menstrual blood. Okay, it's so taboo that I can hardly even talk about it in this class. I do, because we're kind of getting used to it, but it's not all that easy. And actually, in a way, within academia, you're not really allowed to talk about menstruation unless you're doing in medicine, unless you're doing gynecology. To talk about the cultural significance of menstruation, it's still, we have to remember our universities, not so long ago, a couple of hundred years ago, they were theological colleges. One does not talk about those things. One talks about blood in religion, the blood of Jesus, for example, the blood of, the sacrificial lamb, the animals and so forth. One does not talk about menstrual blood in a cultural context. It's just not done. So it is actually quite difficult, even for RAG, for us to talk about these things. But kind of you have to, in order to be kind of respectful of Indigenous thinking, where these things are absolutely central. So let me just say, I just mentioned that Louisa's complaint that menstruation is only seen as polluting, as negative, as oppression, not as power. What do I mean by power? I haven't brought the book along, but one of the finest books in all of anthropology is a book by Peter Gow. I would so much recommend it. It's called An Amazonian Myth and Its History. I won't go into it, it'll take far too long, but in that wonderful book, where he takes one single myth in its context and you just see a whole new world as you follow the logic of that argument. At the center of it all is the ritual of these people called the Piru in Peru. And it's called Kigimaulo. It's the biggest ceremony of the community. And it's a celebration of what happens when a girl first menstruates. People come from up and down the river, this tributary of the Amazon, for this joyful, powerful ceremony where everyone comes together. It lasts weeks. The build-up, the ceremony, and what happens is that as the guests and the hosts are all arriving for this great ceremony, the first time they set eyes on each other, they see each other as jaguars and anacondas and parrots, because they're all dressed up in their feathers and their costumes and their spots. And the most intensively decorated person of all is, guess who? It's the girl at the center of it all. She is the jaguar. She is the jaguar woman. When she emerges from seclusion, her future husband sees her for the first time. He sees his bride, his future wife, as a jaguar. Beautifully decorated her body with the spots of the jaguar. He has to take it very seriously. He does not think, this young woman is dressed up as a jaguar. No. He has to take her at her word. She is truly a jaguar. Be very careful. Do not look too closely. Bow your head and respect. She is the true jaguar. Across Amazonia, whenever a girl was menstruating, she would go through a very powerful initiation ritual and become either a jaguar or an anaconda, a snake, or a tapir, but some kind of animal. And the critical point about these animals, the way they're chosen, is that they're on a predator-prey relationship. predator and prey from the point of view of humans. Now, I'm going to read out a story, not from Amazonia, but from California, which makes the point I want to make, I think, probably better than I can just giving a kind of talk, a lecture. And it's actually in my book, Blood Relations, in the chapter called The Sex Strike, because my own view is that men did not invent the incest taboo at all. Women had to get together to say, our bodies are ours, no means no, we don't want sex with you just now. And, you know, the signal of like no means no, with a coalition of women, was blood, menstrual blood, anything connected with menstrual blood like red pigment or ochre. And those women needed to make very, very clear with their bodies, not just whispering no, like in like a continent of vowel, but really quite a loud and insistent and repetitive no, that they meant, what they were saying. So I'm going to read a story the point I want to come out of this is that women need to women who want to say no to men's approaches when they're unwelcome, they've got to think about what do you do with your body? Because the female body to the biological human male looks pretty attractive. How do you deal with that? How do you make your body signal no? This is a California myth of 7 sisters recorded early in the 19th century in Los Angeles County. The 7 sisters. There were 7 brothers married to 7 sisters who lived in a large hut together. The men went daily to hunt rabbits, and the women to gather roots of flags for food. The husbands invariably reported bad luck in their hunt, with the exception of the youngest, who without fail handed his wife a rabbit. This continued every day until the females held a conference and became convinced that they were being cheated by their partners. They agreed that the youngest sister should remain at home the next day under pretext of having a pain in her jaw, and so watch the return of the hunters. Next day, the men, as usual, took their bows and arrows and set forth. The 6 sisters then departed, leaving the other concealed among the flags and rushes at the back of the hut, in a position from which you could see all that happened inside. Several hours before sunset, the hunting party returned laden with rabbits, which they commenced roasting and eating, except one, which the youngest set apart. The others called him a fool and bade him eat the remaining one, which he refused to do, saying he still had some affection for his wife and always intended to reserve one rabbit for her. More fool you, said the others. We care more for ourselves than for these root diggers. When they had finished, they carefully hid all the evidence of their feast. When all this was later reported to the sisters, they cried a great deal and talked over what they should do. Now, this next bit is the critical part. It's what do you do as a group of women to punish the men who are cheating on you, to say no, okay? What do you do? Let us turn into water, said the eldest. That would never do, responded the rest, for in that case our husbands would drink us. The second proposed being turned into stones, which was rejected on the ground of being trodden upon by the fraternity. The third wanted to turn themselves into trees, which was not accepted because they would be used for firewood. Everything proposed was put aside until it came to the turn of the youngest. Her proposition to change themselves into stars was objected to on account of being seen, but then overruled as they would be out of reach. They proceeded to the lagoon, where they daily collected flag roots and constructed a machine impossible to describe out of reeds, and ascended to heaven and located themselves at the Pleiades, the constellation of the 7 sisters. These 7 stars still retain the names of the originals. Can you see what I'm trying to say? You've got to work out, as a group of sisters, what to metamorphose into in order to convey this rather important message of resistance. Of course, the stars, they're not animals. Actually, though, most of the constellations are animals, the bear, all the various other, Scorpio, the various other all cultures treat these constellations kind of as totemic ancestral beings and constellations. But yeah, of course, in here we don't have them turning themselves into animals. What I'm suggesting is, and of course I've got matters of evidence, I've just given you part of the evidence, is that what women would do would turn themselves into an animal, collectively into an animal, and just to make the point even more obvious with their bodies, a really big animal and a male one. Turning back to Amazonia, in the Valpes region of Amazonia, and northwest border with Colombia, a group called the Dasana, one of the Chicano Indians. The girls have a ritual for first menstruation, not too different from the one I mentioned from the Piro with the jaguar. They go into seclusion the girl will go into seclusion during that period, and she goes into a kind of hut made of 6 tapir hides. So the women who organize this ritual, they take the tapir, they sew the hides together. So the woman goes into a huge tapir. You know what a tapir is? I mean, a lovely animal, looks a bit like a pig. It's huge, beautiful thing, lovely to hunt, of course. But you have a giant one. And this giant tapir is called Thunder Tapir, and it's a terrifying god. The girl turns into this terrifying figure. It's a male figure, it's an animal figure, and it's bleeding. Now, what's so interesting is that in that tribe, everything's very clear. Because when people go hunting for tapir, actually any other animal they hunt, but tapir, there are 2 kinds of tapir. There's a tapir which is just an animal, and there's a tapir which is really a human being, wrapped up in the skin of a tapir. And what the people say is that when you're hunting tapir, you've got to be very careful what you think. In order to be able to kill and eat the animal, you must think of it not as a shaman would. You mustn't think with vision. You mustn't think of the true tapir, which is, of course, a human being, okay, going through initiation, very, very powerful, becoming metamorphosed out of resistance into tapir god. You must just try to just hunt on the assumption that the animal's just an animal and you kill it and eat it. Because as soon as you think like a shaman would, in other words, if you think truthfully, if you kind of remember that the true tapir is a human being in a tapir skin, I mean, it's just terrible. You'll be a cannibal. You'll be eating a human being. So sometimes the hunters in this tribe, they actually kind of make a mistake. They realized that as they were killing the tapir, they were thinking it's probably a human being. Now that human being, tapir, will tell its family who killed it, and there'll be terrible retribution. So what the hunters do when they kill the tapir, they cut out its tongue and throw it away, so that the tapir can't tell its family who killed it. Okay. What am I saying here? I'm saying that the animals who think they're humans, I remember I was asking that question, why would they think they're humans? It's a really difficult question. What do you think my answer is? Have a guess. Why would they think they're humans in the light of what I've just been saying? Oh dear. Well, all right, I agree it's difficult. The answer is very simple. It's because they are humans. How can a jaguar be a human? I've just told you. As a woman, when you're initiated, now your initiation sets the pattern for your life. You've been initiated. It's almost a traumatic experience, a hugely important thing. You become an adult. As a jaguar, you are woman jaguar. Or, among the Dasana, you are the tapir, the great thunder god. Why do these animals, jaguar woman, the great tapir, why do you think they're humans? Because they're humans. They're under the skin, they're humans. You've got to be very. I mentioned to you when a young man meets his future bride, she's the jaguar. He can't even touch her, let alone poke a arrow into her or eat her or something. I mean, you can't even touch her. The idea that you could kill her and eat her, I mean, just absolutely. This is like eating. I don't know. It's like worse than eating God, because of course, Chris, you do eat God on communion. Obviously, lots of rules around it, but I mean, you are allowed to drink that blood under certain conditions. But and of course, actually, in these cultures, you can kill the animals under certain conditions, but the conditions are quite severe. But as I was saying, among the Dasana, you must be aware that the tapir are doubled. There's ordinary animal tapirs, just kill them, hunt them, eat them, cook them. So even then, of course, you could be quite careful with the blood and all that. But you want to be really careful about messing with a tapir who's actually a human. And so one of the things which Viveris de Castro emphasizes is this idea of skin change. So, and he points out that when you've got a human being in an animal skin, he says it's not just that the skin is some kind of superficial covering over the real creature. He's arguing, and this is true, that the skin makes what's inside the skin real, if you like, almost like more real than reality. So the Dasana, they will say about the tapirs, some tapir are just animals, you can kill them. But the true tapir under the skin is a human being. What's that meaning of that word true? It means for a shaman, when you're thinking properly, when you're thinking as an initiated adult, when you know the secrets, when you have the full interior knowledge, when you can see beyond appearances, that tapir is a human being. So, next question, I'll finish in a moment. I mentioned earlier that according to perspectivism, all these animals are kind of pissed off because they're resentful at the fact that they used to have bows and arrows and cooked roast meat and lived in big grand houses, and all that culture was stolen from them. Right. I'm simply saying the reason they're pissed off is because, as I mentioned earlier, the stories are nothing to do with the transition from nature to culture. They're about the establishment of male dominance. When male dominance is established in a culture which has previously been gender egalitarian, what happens is that instead of being women with their menstrual periods being connected with the moon, being supernaturally potent, having all these powers, what happens is increasingly the shamans become men who also know how to become animals and how to bleed in certain ways, rather like menstrual blood. So, of course, if increasingly these powerful animals within which are women acting as animals, but being animals in a very true sense, if what's happening is that those animals are gradually being replaced by a different kind of animal, namely men doing those sort of things which women used to do, and increasingly displacing women's powerful menstrual ceremonies by men's male initiation ceremonies, well, you'd expect those women, or if you like, those animals, because women have to be animals when they're being ferocious and defiant, for the reasons I've just explained. You'd expect them to be a bit disgruntled because they really have been robbed of culture. Because what happens, and this is what happens in these myths that Levi-Strauss is talking about, and it's what Levi-Strauss himself says, women become treated as nature. Okay, in other words, as like other animals. And given that actually in real life women invented the incest taboo, cooking, all these other things, actually, and there's a very powerful arguments to say that, you can imagine why women themselves, therefore the animals that people treat them as, will be feeling that they have been robbed. I can't just quite leave it there, because I'd probably just leave you all feeling a bit unsatisfied. So within RAG, not all of us, but kind of most of us, I think, within RAG over the years, we kind of think we've more or less worked out how human culture was established. Now, one of the things which needed to be established is this very simple principle fundamental to all the world's religions, which is that some things are sacred. What needed to be established first and foremost was that the body is sacred. Females human females, let's face it, are not very good at one particular thing. I've seen you looking really very shocked at this. Women are not so good at violence as men, on average. Now, if you think that being human is all about violence, and there are people that think that, there's a whole bellicose school of what theory. I mean, you know, there was a killer ape theory. You know, humans are killer apes. They had all these weapons and stuff. And there's a very popular warfare model these days about violence. So if you think that, you know, if you think that becoming human, developing language, developing religion, all that was all about being extra violent, of course it would make sense to say that men were doing that. Actually, the whole point about language is that it doesn't work if violence is the language people speak. You need a lot of trust, cooperation, to be able to function in a world where just these very, very quiet sounds that we make when speaking would even work as forms of communication. So you need a lot of egalitarianism, a lot of trust, egalitarianism, and actually, in our model within the radical anthropology group here, we actually say that the fundamental rule wasn't even the rule against rape, against incest. The much more deep rule is the rule against rape. Women had to establish some things are sacred. Our bodies are sacred. No means no. That was the fundamental rule. And if women were doing that while menstruating, the brilliance of that was that becoming defiant while bleeding, turning into animals while bleeding, turning into male animals while bleeding. Can you see what's happening? Just like Jaguar woman, this is just what actually does happen. But we're saying it happened at the origin of culture as well, and it's kept on happening ever since. Okay, women have turned into, let's just say, I don't know, a particular antelope in Africa, eland bull. Okay, now you see a real eland bull. Can you see what's happening? You have the women turning into the magical eland bull, or the rainbow snake, or the dragon, or the tapir, whatever. But now you see a real animal. Can you see how, once you've been initiated and you can see true things, you've got a kind of problem. Is this the sacred animal, which with intentionality that you can't really kill, it's a ritual thing, or is it just an animal I'm allowed to kill and eat? There's always going to be that ambivalence once you've had that thing. So, okay, I mean, how do I end here? The culture I know best, Camilla's done proper fieldwork with a group called the Hadza in Tanzania. These are among the world's last surviving hunters who hunt with bows and arrows in the area of East Africa where we evolved, hunting relatively large game animals, even to this day, up to a point. Obviously they've got problems these days. And I remember giving a talk, rather like this talk, but way back, was it 1993, I think? I was giving a talk on this whole theory that women turning into animals while menstruating means that you are both the animal that you're hunting and also the animal hunted, because you've turned into that hunted animal while bleeding. Can you see what's happening? Your menstrual blood has now become the blood of the hunted game animal, both of which are sacred. I remember just giving this rather theoretical talk, and James Woodburn, the great expert on the Hadza, he said, oh, yeah. He said, among the Hadza, when a girl first has a menstrual period, everyone celebrates. And I've got the Hadsani word here. I won't pronounce it wrong. I won't pronounce it right. It's got a big click in front of it. It's Akakwa Dongo. And what that means is she has shot her zebra. So packed in there is predator and prey, turned into an animal, a bleeding animal. You become sacred. It's kind of the origin of the whole complex scheme. And I don't know, I just feel, how can perspectivists have got it so sadly wrong as to really imagine that the actual jaguars and animals, I mean, maybe I'm not being quite fair, but as far as I can work out, reading very carefully, the perspectivists give more credence to this perspective than to what I would call science. But I just think, how can you accuse really intelligent Amazonian hunter-gatherers of just thinking that the jaguars, tapirs, peccaries, parrots all think of themselves as humans? And my answer to that difficult question is no, they don't. Okay, that's it.
We've got plenty of time for questions.
Okay, here we are.
To be here
Okay.
answering.
Okay, sorry. We're just having a little discussion about the origins of the incest taboo, and I think I probably,
Yeah, talk to
Yeah.
everyone on Zoom.
Okay, so I'm so sorry because Camilla was fixing all this, and I thought we were. So I think pretty much everyone here. Obviously, I've been a bit persuasive. Perhaps I've been talking too much, but I think people agree with me that it's most unlikely that the incest prohibition in humans was a male invention. Much more likely that resistance to incest would have come from sex which incurs the cost, if there are any costs, genetic costs, and those would be females. And we already know from chimpanzees and other great ape relatives of ours that females tend not to want their sons, brothers, fathers, and so on to hassle them for sex, and they themselves push those males away if they can. But sometimes, of course, with chimpanzees, the females are raped by by an older brother. So I'm simply saying that's an underlying thing, that the fundamental rule of human society was the rule against rape. That had to be established by females. In the course of human evolution, females had to come together to form coalitions to do that. And in order to resist male unwanted approaches, they had to use body language. They had to metamorphose into some, display, not their ordinary human female, therefore rather attractive to males display, as in the myths. What do we turn ourselves into? Water, no, the men will drink us. Stones, no, they're telling us. Wood, no, they'll burn us for firewood. Let's make ourselves attractive but unavailable. So they turn themselves into those stars. But we know from all sorts of ethnography, what women actually do most often is turn themselves into a very powerful animal. The jaguar in Amazonia, the eland bull in parts of Africa, great anaconda in other parts of Amazonia, the rainbow snake, the kind of dragon in Australia. So you turn yourselves into a creature which is joined up, big, imposing, and everything which the male doesn't want to have if he wants to have sex. And therefore those animals you turn into are the supernatural ones. And those are the ones that kind of have human agency and human attributes. And if you like, think of themselves as humans, the reason being because they are humans.
There is an interesting question on Zoom. Josie, do you want to ask that question on the Zoom platform? Josie's saying, do you see two-eyed seeing of Albert Marshall
that's a lovely question.
Perspectivist? Say some more.
Yes, okay.
About the idea of depth.
Yeah, okay, now, okay, really thank you for that, because I see a complete opposition between two-eyed seeing and perspectivism. Why? Because as I understand it, the perspectivism coming from Viveros de Castro is making science and indigenous wisdom not connect up. He's pointing out, he argues that they're so different, they're so incommensurable, they're so at loggerheads with each other that there's no common ground, and he prefers on this level, I'm sure as a real human being, he probably agrees with climate science and goes on aeroplanes, reasonably confident that some scientists have made sure the thing will stay up and all that. But in his role as a perspectivist anthropologist, he seems to be overwhelmingly favoring these perspectives, Amerindian perspectives, as he calls them, at the expense of Western science, on the grounds that you've got to choose because they're just completely the opposite of each other. Whereas two-eyed seeing, as developed by Albert Marshall, is quite the opposite. It's trying to find points of convergence between indigenous ways of knowledge and science. So there's a very big difference. And what I'm arguing is certainly not that science is like to be preferred. There's all sorts of things wrong with science, and science very, very often has got things so ideologically wrong that it really needs to listen to indigenous thinking. And a good example, by the way, is the whole topic of menstruation. All over the world, indigenous people think that menstruation has got something to do with the moon. You will find science, and it's really strange, this thing called science, Western science, look up Wikipedia, any dictionary, any textbook, they will tell you that menstruation has got nothing to do with the moon. I prefer Indigenous wisdom, because then that makes you ask a question about menstruation and the moon, and it's sure enough, it turns out there's a reason why the lengths are the same, and we won't go into all that, but I'm just, that's an example of Indigenous thinking getting something right, and science under patriarchy getting things extremely wrong, particularly things which matter most politically and in terms of gender. Science has been absolutely hopeless in so many of those areas, horribly ideologically distorted and kind of useless. And we desperately need to be taught how to get out of those holes. And many Indigenous people can help us to do that.
Any questions in the room? Sure you'll go.
Yes.
I'm wondering if it's the difference between Western thinking as a metaphor. So we've taken lots of myths to be metaphors for something, whereas this is being seen as something literal. And like we can't sort of get our head around this literal thing. But if you take like Catholicism with transmogrification, you know, that Catholics actually believe they are living, eating the flesh of God, drinking the blood of Christ, that we actually just, I mean, I'm not Catholic, but that's just taken for granted here. Isn't that like the same sort of disparity between literally
that's such a that's such a
repeat to
okay.
those
So I mean,
so
sorry, yes.
clear.
The question is about metaphor, and is the problem here rather like I've been asked the problem of this woman being an animal, being a jaguar, is the problem of that actually would be a metaphor that she's a jaguar, not to be taken literally, rather in the same way that within Catholicism we should understand that the idea that Jesus is a sacrificial lamb whose blood we drink, we should understand it as a metaphor, not to be taken literally. It's a brilliant question, but the problem is that in order to be religion, you mustn't just treat something as, oh, just a metaphor, oh, it's just symbolism.
No, but I don't think Catholics do. And I think they hold that.
Okay. I mean, I know all about this because I'm a Catholic. I was brought up a Catholic, and it's but
we do have that, which is sort of seems to me similar to the
well, yes, that's a kind of cognitive dissonance. You think one thing and you think the other thing. So with one part of yourself, you kind of know it's just a bit of bread and this is a bit of wine. But on the other hand, in your role as a devout Catholic, you mustn't just say this is, I mean, obviously Protestantism ended up doing that, it's just a symbol. But as a devout Catholic before the Reformation, you mustn't just say, oh, it's just a metaphor. You must treat this as genuinely the blood of Jesus. I mean, but I'm aware of what you're saying, that on another level, you won't. So, well, I'm not even thought it's the way the West thinks, because you see, what I'm saying is that when that girl, that Piro girl during Kigamalo, when she makes her first appearance, she's the most beautiful, powerful, impressive girl with all these wonderful decorations on her skin. She looks magnificent, and she is a jaguar. And it's the important thing is that the young man who wants to be, wants her to be his bride, he mustn't think of it, oh, it's just a woman dressed up as with spots. He must treat her as more jaguar, real jaguar, literal jaguar, than the jaguar you might meet out in the forest. Because otherwise it's not religion, it's not faith. And if you think it's just a metaphor, what would be the consequences? I mean, the point is the consequences, if you act as if she's a real jaguar, you really are very careful about how you treat her. So it is metaphor, but there's a level within.
It's a metaphor. I'm not saying we've got the right, that we're saying it from the right perspective, because I think with magical realism as a genre, like that was appropriated by European literature as a genre. But actually, I've spoken to people, and it's like things they say, it's literal, you know. And I remember speaking to someone from Cuba.
Somewhere.
Cuba, talking about her period.
Yeah.
And she said it was a river. And I said, no, you're exaggerating. And she went, no, it was literally a river.
Yeah.
And it's like she believed it's literally a river. So I think it's like a perspective of
Well-
looking at something. So I saw her speaking as a metaphor.
Yes, I
which
know, but
wasn't-
there's a whole theory of metaphor. I'm actually having to write a sort of book on it all with Jerome about original language. But one of the major theories within metaphor is that what is the meaning of a metaphor? It's like if you say John is a pig, what do you mean? Do you mean he's a bit messy, he's a bit greedy? Well, I mean, you know, and all those things. And the point is, you're saying, no, he's literally a pig. He's literally a pig. Yeah, pig. And you say, well, has he got trotters? Did they get sliced up for bacon? No, but he's literally a pig. So it's if you say he's like a pig,
Yeah,
that's got no force.
yeah.
If you say he's a pig, it's got force. And you're wanting people to sort of take it sort of as literally as they can, given, of course, that he's not going to get sliced up, he hasn't got trotters or a curly tail and all those things. So it's quite subtle. So I think there's a very important difference between metaphor and other figures of speech, like, you know, simile. One thing really important to say in response to your question, actually, all these magical myths, these myths that Claude Lévi-Strauss talks about, they are extraordinarily elaborate metaphors. So what's brilliant about that is that idea, which is, I mean, I can't see anyone can possibly doubt it, is that those myths are true in the way that metaphors are true. Of course, with any metaphor, you have to sort of look to the intention. When somebody says he's a pig, yeah, he's a pig. He really is a pig, you know. But obviously, the intention is to get across just what a wretched, greedy, messy, brutish, disrespectful guy this person is. So, but that what this whole idea of metaphor means in mythology is that it really is worth just considering: are these myths true? Because I think they are. I think they're true. I think Jack and the Beanstalk is true. I mean, I've got into trouble for saying this, of course. I've heard people saying, "Oh, Chris Kni, he bases his theory on fairy tales." But what I'm saying is that as soon as you realise that metaphor must be taken literally, something like that, for it to work, which is quite a dominant paradigm within metaphor theory, then you think, okay, I know it's all about a frog and a princess and all these things, but behind it, there's a really profound truth. You've got to look behind that, take it very seriously. What is this myth all about? Okay, I read out this story about the seven sisters. Okay, maybe it didn't happen. They turned into stars. But I think that story is just so, I think that story is, I don't know, it's worth all the theories about human origins that have been piled up on library shelves for centuries. It's a brilliant insight into how we became human. That story about turning into stars. The brilliant thing is that if women turn into stars, they're sexy, they're attractive, they're enticing, they want you. No, you can't have us. That's the idea of that. I mean, that just captures something about
the machine that's impossible.
And of course,
to
the machine,
describe.
and of course, what they do before going up into the
Interesting,
sky, they
yeah.
go into the reeds, and it's quite clear to me from all sorts of other evidence that machine impossible to describe. Why is it impossible to describe? Because the narrator was talking to a white man who hadn't got a clue. It's a menstrual hut. The women go into this thing in the marshes made of reeds, and they go into another world. That's what you do when you synchronize your menstrual periods together. You go into seclusion. Seclusion is like a kind of death. You go into the other world. So I'm just saying that myth it's a true myth. And
isn't that what they're saying in South America? That's literal.
yes, that's good. But what I'm trying to say is okay, but what exactly is true? Is it true that jaguars think they're humans? Okay, let me.
Is it expressing that as a metaphor?
Oh, this is so interesting. This is such a good challenge. Thank you so much. It's really, what you're saying is really brilliant. What I'm suggesting is that the indigenous people make a distinction, rather like the distinction between, as you're saying, she can't really think her period is a river.
Yeah.
They make a sort of, like, in everyday life, these people, I'm sure, know that these are jaguars and they don't think they're human at all. And you know, the tapirs, you know, they're tasty, you can kill them and eat them. But there's another level, which is the religious level, if you like.
So like the transmogrification.
Where because women or other shamans can turn into a jaguar, you You never know when you see a jaguar. Is it a shaman?
Spirit jaguar,
Oh, it's-
spirit tapir.
And it's so interesting because right across I mean, I should really, one more point I haven't said in the talk earlier on, is that these Amazonian perspectives, they're in no way confined to the Amazon. Right across the world, you have this idea that animals have spirit guardians, spirit companions. There's the great bear, there's the, I don't know, where all hunter-gatherers are respectful of the animals they kill. You mustn't laugh at them, for example, especially if they're bleeding. You must, and the idea is that there's a kind of immortal spirit of the animal which will take vengeance on you if you abuse the animal. Look at the cave paintings on the Doidoin, those great bison and horses. What are they? They're not just ordinary animals. They're woman bison. You actually see women turning into bison. These are the great spirits of the animals that you've got to be. And so young boys would have been taken into those caves, initiated, and you've seen them in their flickering light. Ah, I know. I'm going to be quite careful when I'm hunting a horse or a bison. These immortal spirits, guardians of the animals, you can't kill them. And if you disrespect the animals, you will get punished. Be very careful.
Can we pick up on Zoom? There's quite a few questions. So one question was about making sense of Öcalan's contention. The first oppression was that of women.
Yeah.
I think you explained why. Of course, it's mainly an Amazon history here rather than Middle Eastern, but yes, that's one thing. Manchego here is telling us that those stories about the Seven Sisters have maybe 100,000-year-old time depth,
yeah.
which I believe comes from the studies of Aboriginal astronomy that are suggesting that.
Yeah, just to say on that, because actually the stars nowadays there's only 6 of them. So the fact is one of them sort of vaguely disappeared, and it takes a long time for them to disappear.
Yeah.
So we know they must be 100,000 years old to have even seen 7. Yeah.
Is the idea about that. Somebody else wanting to know about the panther bride, literally being a panther or jaguar, early referring to panthers thinking themselves human. Are we simply alluding to interconnectedness? Is there a continuation of colonial thinking in a panther thinking itself human, as if hierarchically at the top being human?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think you're right there.
Yeah,
I think you're right there. I mean, I think to be honest, I don't see this hugely anti-colonial movement as all that anti-colonial. I think it would be a bit more anti-colonial to have a gendered perspective on things, and really to see. I mean, I don't know, to see what was celebrated about both genders and different kinds of blood, and to see this potency of blood as critical to Amazonian, but also all human, if you like, civilization. What made us human? How do we become human? You had to establish that some things are sacred. If nothing's sacred, I mean, I know that under capitalism, nothing is sacred. Everything's got a price. You could sell your grandmother if you make enough profit out of it. But I mean, but any decent human society, there's certain things that are held sacred. I mean, we've got a strike next Tuesday. You never cross a picket line, for example. So, and that's a pretty sacred rule, part of my religion. So I tend to agree with the implication in that suggestion there. I don't quite see that it's all that decolonize this whole way of thinking. I think there's elements of colonialism still lurking around there. Yeah.
Any more questions from the audience?
Camilla, do you have any comments?
Well, I was going to say, I saw something this week in, it was being touted all over Nature, so big announcements in Nature. They are establishing something in the US called the Center for Braiding Knowledge, Science and Indigenous Knowledges, Braiding Science and Indigenous Knowledges. So it's very, very up to the minute, this idea that Indigenous knowledge and science should be speaking to each other and inform each other. And they've got huge finances for this, with projects coming from all over the Americas, Canada, to the US. And yes, examples of with Indigenous scientists and scholars leading projects trying to sort of combine approaches. Archaeologists who are working on prairie archaeology, doing work on sort of metis bead work and this kind of thing.
Yeah, great.
The other thing to say is that there's so much ecology. So we're talking about the real knowledge of Indigenous people, traditional ecological knowledge, tech of animals. So you've mentioned the eland bull, for instance. Western science is only beginning to catch up with understanding of the movements and habits and behaviors of animals that are utterly sacred to African hunter-gatherers, like eland bulls, for instance. There's mature eland bulls with their clicking knees. Their knees click as tendons slip, and they create this extraordinary clicking noise, which is central in the dances, the most ancient dances of Bushman people and also Hadza people, their Pene dances, as part of their kind of fundamental rituals. And they knew all this before Western ecologists were working out what's going on with those eland bulls. Similar killer whales, which have now become, orcas have become the model for understanding menopause and grandmothers, which people on the Northwest Coast, Pacific Coast, understood the orcas as their ancestors, matrilineal ancestors. They understood the social structures that were in the orca pods, which they took as a reflection of their own ancestry. So these are some examples in the ecology of.
I mean, another thing to say is that when it comes to what does it mean to be human, I mean, it's not where science in the West began at all. A huge amount of Western science was driven by military imperatives. What it means to be human is just like kind of the last thing, even now, vaguely, kind of around. Whereas, as Richard Lee was one of the first people to seriously study the Kalahari San people. He was a Marxist. He's still active. He described the way of life of the Kalahari San, the Bushmen, as communism, a form of communism. And his point is that they know what it means to be human because they still are human, but it's not like they arrived at being human and they think, okay, we're here now, we're human. There's a constant need to reestablish humanity because there's always a sort of risk of slipping back into something else. So, and the work we've been doing in RAG with our colleagues, and I perhaps the best formulation is that of Morna Finnegan. She kind of improves, I think, a little bit Richard Lee's concept of like primitive communism. She calls it communism in motion, and she's talking now about what happens today among the Benjeli and other Bayaka forest people, which is that they don't just make human life by performing their rituals. They establish power. This is women, and the ritual among the Benjeli is called Ngoku. The women establish their own matriarchy. Women rule, but women don't rule for very long because they get fed up with ruling. They want to surrender their power, let the men have a go, and then have another revolution. And they almost, Morna points out, it's almost as if when the men perform their ritual, which is called a Jengi, it's quite muscular, potentially because of the muscles and the weaponry, potentially violent. And it's almost as if the women are wanting the men to almost pose a kind of threat to them, but don't let it get too far in order to provoke the women into having their revolution again. So you have a kind of revolution, an on-purpose counter-revolution when the men take over, another revolution as a result of that, and they've been doing it ever since. Now, why am I saying that's significant here? Is because it's the people that become human and then delightfully become animals again, because everybody likes sex and you can just do what you feel like, follow your instinct, and then you become sort of culturally human with all these religious norms again. It's like, how we became human because it wasn't in the distant past. It's not like hunter-gatherers are primitive people. They're doing these things today, and they know more about it because they're having to win the human revolution because they don't have all this technology and all that stuff. And also because, unlike people in the West, they haven't kind of lost the plot completely. I've been doing in so many ways, actually, in the West, with all our hierarchies, and very little egalitarianism or sharing. We're actually quite close to chimpanzees. Chimpanzees have an alpha male, they have hierarchies, they have competition, they have conflict. The whole world today is looking rather like a chimpanzee hierarchy, and hunter-gatherers are way, way ahead of us.
Shakti, did you have a question? Your hand was up.
Yeah,
Okay.
actually, it was not so much a question, but a kind of comment on things that both you and Chris have said. One about taking metaphors literally, and the other about how much ecological knowledge there is to amongst indigenous people that can be used, and that can be used as a start point to investigate. So I think there's so much animal behavior and other studies going on, where the hypotheses being tested are in some ways not as grounded in natural history as they could be. And that grounding, of course, can come from, the people who actually live amongst those animals and watch them every day. But also, in terms of taking metaphors literally, now obviously these knowledge systems, so the scientific knowledge system is also bringing knowledge to people, to indigenous people in various places. And their ecologies are also changing in terms of the animals and the plants around them because of everything that's happening in the world. So I wonder whether they themselves might, the myths themselves might, and the metaphors might be transforming, and they might have questions about those myths and metaphors as well, which in some ways a scientific perspective could help to hone that. So as their own myths, because those myths are arising from a point in the past about, describing populations and things as they existed at a point in time, but things have transformed. And not all youngsters believe the myths that are passed down to them, for instance. And so I think it's both ways, those myths themselves, in one way they can inform what scientists do, but in another way, indigenous people might be interested in understanding what parts of their myths, which parts of them are, literally transformed metaphors, and which are more, ephemeral.
You put it better than I did. Thank you, Shakti. That's lovely. Absolutely right. Absolutely. On both sides, they can temper the other. There's all sorts of valuable insights. Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. Beautifully put. And also it's nice because we could hear you. You've got a very good sound system. Mostly on Zoom, we can't hear what's going on, but you've got a very nice microphone. But that's not the main thing. The main thing is what you said, and I couldn't agree more. Lovely.
Thank you.
Manchego, I'm going to ask if there's any more questions in the room, and then maybe Manchego, and then maybe we should wrap up for tonight.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something, Manchego? Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the fact that, at least in the Western mythology, when people settle down and then they get cities, they're the person or being that brings civilization to them. In the case of the Mesopotamia, they were fishmen. They had fish tails. And in the case of the Greeks, you got Chiron, the centaur, or you have Cecrops, who has a snake body from the waist down, who founds Athens.
Well, I mean, as I said, when you're initiated, you go through a metamorphosis. I mean, there's no question that, and if you're not initiated, you won't have all the power needed to do these amazing things, to found Athens, to found civilization. So in a sense, you've got to be more than human to do these things, and changing a skin, becoming some kind of animal, while retaining human characteristics. So of course, one of the ways you can be an animal but somehow a human is to have an animal skin but it's got a human soul somewhere inside you. But of course, another one is to have, like a mermaid, you can have a human top and a fishy body, fishy lower half. So of course, all these lion-headed men, these anthropomorphs, these theriomorphs, therianthropes is the word. Sorry, therianthropes is the word. Half human, half. I mean, those images capture this movement between animal and human state. Is a sort of static image that you can have as an icon. You can draw it. So and actually one of the very first bits of art we know, Hollenstein-Stadel, what date is that? Is in German?
It's
It's
35,000.
35,000. It's a lion-headed man. So I
Leaving
mean,
it, yeah.
Possibly man or
so,
woman. must
yeah,
be.
yeah. So these things go way back. But the reason they go way back is because in ritual, and the initial rituals, for no doubt about it, the most powerful rituals would be women's first menstruation rituals. I don't think that can be doubted. You need to turn into animals to be powerful.
Then you've got like dream hibernation, where incubation, where people wrap themselves up in a sheepskin while they sleep,
All right.
like that.
Okay. Yeah, that must feel quite good. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to intervene because I think we're coming to a couple of things to say before. One, there's a lovely recommendation from Leoncia on the Zoom chat of the beautiful book some of you may have heard of, Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is very much interested in, she's an Indigenous scholar and author, very much interested in this subject of this kind of braiding of knowledges. We're reminded by Sirka here, thank you very much. Next week, we're going to do a kind of double act on the sex strike theory of human origins. I'm saying don't miss that if you're interested in the RAG classes. But because we can't cross the picket line really at all, we're going to be on Zoom only. But please come back in 2 weeks when we should have a wonderful talk from Darshana Vaiz on mature human nature, the evolved nest. She's a neuroscientist, psychologist, very interested in the emergence of human moral development and the kind of the niche within and what that does to a human body and a human mind when we have that. And these are the contexts that indigenous cultures foster. So she's really going to be talking about that. So it will be a kind of combination of Western science with indigenous knowledges. So yes, that's in 2 weeks' time. Tonight I'm going to shut down on the Zoom. Thank you very much, everybody on Zoom. It's been fantastic to have your presence, your intervention. Really lovely to see old friends and new friends. So I'm going to say goodbye to everybody on Zoom and then tell people goodbye to everyone.